Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We'll just give everyone another moment to log in. Often there are technological difficulties, so we'll give a minute for that. In the meantime, I'll just talk about how foggy it is around Weyburn, so I hope everyone is staying safe on the roads out there. It's really quite thick, so we'll just give it another minute here. A few more have trickled in, so just a few more seconds. I'm always that person that trickles in a little late too, so. All right, so maybe we can get started. Once again, thank you all so much for joining us today. I know how crazy life has been, and it's the second week of January, so that's always intense and stressful as well. So I am so happy to be joined by Dawn Giesbrecht, the CEO of the Canadian Childcare Federation, Christopher Smith from the Muttart Foundation in Alberta, and Morna Ballantyne, the ED of Childcare Now. So all these individuals have been involved in the roadmap to a quality system in the ELCC in childcare. So, or excuse me, in Saskatchewan. So we've sent out quite a bit of communication to our members and the sector about this document. It was created with the support of many stakeholders throughout the province, and so we were so happy to be able to bring this forward to everyone. So this document is really a map. It's a map to help us figure out the best way to get to a quality system in our province. So from there, I'm just going to do a land acknowledgement. And in Saskatchewan here, we respectfully acknowledge the land on which we gather is situated on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 lands. We recognize all Indigenous people who were here before us, those who live with us now, and the 7 generations to come. As Indigenous people have done since time immemorial, we strive to be responsible stewards of the land and to respect the cultures, ceremonies, and traditions of all who call it home. As we open our hearts and minds to the past, we commit ourselves to working in a spirit of truth and reconciliation to make a better future for all. These are the territories of the Cree, Saulteaux, Stoney, Nakota, Dakota, and the homeland of the Métis Michif Nation. Today, these lands continue to be shared territory and is occupied by many diverse people from near and far. A treaty is an inheritance, a responsibility, and a relationship. And so from there, I will just let everybody know that this will be recorded. There are several files in the panel that you'll see on your screen that you can access. And Dawn will also explain the platform a little bit more. So from here, I'm passing it on. Thank you all so much.
Great. Thanks so much, Georgia, and hello, everybody. Great to connect with all of you online here today. So as Georgia said, we do have a copy of the roadmap in the handout section of the control panel that you are seeing in front of you, as well as we have made a copy of the slides available to you there as well, also in PDF. Now, don't fret if you're having issues downloading them or accessing them. We will make them available via email after the webinar as well. And we will also be sharing out, as Georgia mentioned, a copy or a link to, the recording of this webinar as well, so it can be shared. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these platforms. I know we've talked to many of you via the GoTo platform before on other webinars. But as you know, your microphones are all on mute. You're not sharing your video. But we do want to hear from you in terms of, do you have questions? We fully appreciate that this is new for Saskatchewan, the roadmap that is, and there's so much going on, not just in Saskatchewan, but across Canada in early learning and childcare. So if you have questions for us, and we'll attend to those at the end of the presentation here after we've all said our piece with regards to the slides and the roadmap, we'll get to those questions. Or perhaps you have questions that you'll think of afterwards. We're certainly willing, able, and wanting to answer your questions, not only in the immediate, but down the road as well. And we will be doing more of this kind of work for all of you to help push Saskatchewan and the rest of Canada forward in building systems for early learning and care. So with that, I will get the presentation started here. So just bear with me as I get it going here. Great. Hoping everybody's seeing that. Morna or Chris, if you're not seeing it, if you could just let me know via message, that'd be great to know, or Georgia as well, that'd be great. So here we are. This is the roadmap, the title page, and as Georgia mentioned, we worked on this with many stakeholders in Saskatchewan over summer, and published this and had it out to government and to others in later fall, mid-fall, somewhere in that time frame. As I said, this is in the chat function, or sorry, in the handout function here that is on the control panel. So we worked with, with CCA, with Childcare Now, as Georgia mentioned, with the Muttart Foundation as well, with their support to get this document done for Saskatchewan. And it is new, right? How do we move from where we are in Saskatchewan to where we want to go, and to build a high quality system for children and for families, for communities, and obviously for our workforce. So this comes out of this, right? And I'm hoping you're all aware of this, because this has been something we have all collectively been talking about since April 19th of last year. Hard to believe that we're pushing on a year ago that happened, because it does not feel like that. But with the federal government in their budget on April 19th, 2021, made historic commitments to early learning and childcare, really pinning the economic recovery and the economic future of Canada on building a childcare system, knowing how important it is for women, for families, for children, etc., to have a high quality, affordable system of childcare. And most certainly, and we're going to go into all these pieces in more depth, and most certainly, and you've heard it in Saskatchewan, lots of talk about affordability. But as the roadmap points out, and as I think you all know from your work, it's not just about affordable childcare, right? That's one element of how you build a system, but is not the element of how you build a system. And then this summer, we know that there was the Canada-Saskatchewan agreement to build a system that was announced, I believe it was in early August, that made a lot of headlines, not just in Saskatchewan, but across Canada. And to this date, by the way, there are every province and every territory except for 2 that have signed their agreements, with Ontario not signing an agreement yet, and Nunavut not signing an agreement yet, but fingers crossed that they will in the very near future. So this work with the federal budget and with the Saskatchewan-Canada agreement prompted us to build this roadmap that we're going to be talking about here today, and why it's so important. And then finally, we're also going to look at, what are these next steps? How do we move forward from, presenting this roadmap and having this roadmap to actualizing this roadmap? So as I mentioned, the historic investments that the federal government put into early learning and childcare, it was huge. A number that none of us, I don't think, Morna and Chris, that we were ever expecting. We had certainly hints that it was going to be good, but we never thought that it would be this big. And so in addition to what the federal government already had on the table for childcare, there's an additional $27.2 billion, as well as monies for Indigenous early learning and childcare. And moving forward, because one of the questions always is then specific to agreements is, you don't want it just to end at the end of 5 years, because the original agreements or the original funding packages for 5 years, but then it will continue onwards as the slide says here, of 9.2 billion at the end of these original 5 years that these agreements are for. And by the way, if you've never read the Indigenous Early Learning and Childcare Framework, I do encourage you to do so. That is a historic document. Really charts out a new path between or for Indigenous communities and Indigenous peoples in this country. It's a very simple Google to find it. It's an important read, and I think it's actually, frankly, something that as providers, as professionals, that we all need to be familiar with, especially as we move forward on truth and reconciliation. We also know that as I said earlier, that childcare is being looked at as a pandemic economic driver, social recovery, etc. So important. We know that women have disproportionately been affected by the pandemic in terms of job loss, wage loss, and balancing those roles of being parents, mothers, and continuing to work or not work, whatever the case may be. And so, one of our long-standing talking points has been, that an economy needs high-quality childcare. And this certainly message was listened to on the federal level, and now we need to obviously articulate that and get that moving forward at the provincial and territorial level. Certainly then there was a commitment and is a commitment from the federal government to work collaboratively with its provincial and territorial governments to, as it says, transform our sectors. You've started to see some of that happening in Saskatchewan, and I'm not suggesting to you at this moment it's been a perfect start or it's been necessarily, how it started is how we want it to keep going forward, but it's starting nonetheless. You've seen moves in Saskatchewan to affordability, moves towards supporting the workforce in a different way, things like that. So you're seeing those federal dollars come to reality in Saskatchewan without a doubt. And, again, the affordability has absolutely been a hallmark of all talking points, be they federal, be they provincial or territorial. But we all know this, right? We know that it's not just about affordability for families. We need workforce strategies. We need to figure out our workforce to support the current workforce, to recruit more people into our profession and make it a destination, right? A place. And I know so many of you are struggling. I work closely with many of you in Saskatchewan, and I know how much you're struggling to retain people, people moving to other sectors, to other jobs. So we need to, this has to be a hallmark of one of the integral pieces of how we build a system, is to retain that workforce and grow the workforce, because we also know then there's going to be ambitious expansion plans so that more families have access to high quality care, rural, urban, remote, and hard to serve communities. And we can't do that without a workforce. You know how challenging it is to hold together your programs with Band-Aids, and to cycle through people, frankly, maybe on a daily, if not weekly basis. That's not a way we build a system. That has to change. That dynamic has to change. And so this is our opportunity to do that work. And this is why the roadmap is so important, because we have the opportunity for transformational change. I know I've heard from many people, not just in Saskatchewan, but from across Canada, oh, we're still saying the same thing and still, doing the same thing. Well, yes, but the difference is we've got this incredible opportunity to make these changes, those transformational changes that change the dynamic of childcare for all of you, for families, for communities, etc. So we're going to hear from Chris and Morna now as they go through some more slides. And like I said, please do ask your questions, even make comments within the question pane on the platform. So Chris, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Don. And Don, the slides aren't advancing for me, so I'm still on slide one. Is everybody else, Mona, are they advancing for you? Or?
No, actually, I think, Don, it's not on presentation mode in your slide deck.
Yeah,
all we're seeing is the title slide.
Okay.
But, we see the other slides, but they're very small print on the left-hand side.
Okay. So, just try that.
Yeah, that's great. We're actually on slide 4. So thanks, Don. And,
so you're seeing slide 4 now, Chris?
Yeah, we're good
okay.
to go. Don.
Great.
As
Great.
Former Prime Minister said many years ago. Yeah, thank you and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining the webinar today. I'm speaking from Treaty 6, the same as Georgia. So I won't go through the land acknowledgement in detail, but I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking from traditional meeting and traveling grounds for a number of Indigenous people and the Métis Nation. So what Don has done in the introduction, I'm going to actually speak to the next 3 slides. And so as you see from slide 4, I'm going to talk initially about the Canada-Saskatchewan early learning and childcare agreement, the system building agreement. It was actually signed on Friday, August the 13th. So Friday the 13th turned out to be a good day, I think, in terms of signing an agreement. And I think, as Don said, I mean, in some ways, signing an agreement, it's a very important step forward. But in some ways, signing the agreement is perhaps the easiest part of moving towards making change. So while it's very important that the agreement was signed, that's the starting point now for this transformational change that Don alluded to. And Saskatchewan's agreement was signed literally right before the federal election call. So it was signed on the Friday, with the election call then coming on the Sunday. And Saskatchewan followed very quickly after Manitoba in terms of signing agreement, and then was ahead of Alberta. Alberta didn't sign an agreement until mid-November. So Saskatchewan was the 8th province to sign. And Saskatchewan's agreement, as you probably, hopefully you've had a chance to look through it. Hopefully the agreement is in some ways very similar to the other agreements that have been signed by the majority of jurisdictions now, with commitments to affordability, expansion, quality, and inclusion, and also a reflection on the need to report on the use of federal funds. And I think it's probably fair to say that Saskatchewan signing prior to the election call, it was a pleasant surprise for those of us who were looking, across the country. We had a number of provinces that we anticipated would sign sooner rather than later, and obviously BC was right at the top of the list. And Saskatchewan was in that group where we weren't quite sure how Saskatchewan would find itself coming to an agreement quickly, because unfortunately, prior to the agreement being signed, the provincial government had actually made some comments that were not entirely supportive of federal investments in early learning and childcare, and the province itself had taken more sort of specific positions speaking to the importance of federal funding for healthcare rather than perhaps early learning and childcare, and also raised concerns, and they weren't alone doing this, but they raised concerns about whether federal involvement in the area of provincial jurisdictions should proceed with particular conditions attached. But Saskatchewan did sign an agreement, so it's an important agreement. And what we also have, when you look on the government website, what you also see attached to this part of the agreement is the action plan. I think it's annexed to in the actual agreement. And what the action plan does, the action plan outlines the initial priority areas that the provincial government will be addressing with federal funds for the first 2 fiscal years of the 5-year agreement. So 21, 22, which is now, we're heading to the end of that fiscal year, and then the 22, 23 years. So that particular action plan, it says what Saskatchewan will attend to in those first 2 years of this 5-year agreement. It doesn't give a lot of details on how they will attend to the issues, but it does indicate what the priorities are. And so I'm going to try to give you some sense of what those priorities look like, if you like, from a 30,000 foot perspective. You will have experienced them from a much closer frontline and director and leadership perspective, but I'm going to try to step back a little bit and put them into a broader context. The first thing to say about the agreement is that the federal investments, it's $1.1 billion over 5 years. And I think, as Don said, I mean, these are historic levels of investment. I mean, this funding is not only historic, it's almost unprecedented in new investments to support early learning and childcare over a 5-year period. And these investments, these federal investments, I think one of the important things that I've reflected on is these federal investments, they actually make the federal government the senior funding partner in early learning and childcare in almost every jurisdiction. The possible exception might be Quebec in terms of some of the initial years of investment, but the federal government is now the senior government funding partner for early learning and childcare, and that's a very important change from where we've seen provincial governments primarily carrying the weight of the load. In terms of the investments over the 5 years, they actually escalate, so they increase over the 5 years. The first year's investment for 21-22, which is now almost over, is about $114 million, and over the 5 years, that money increases to over $315 million in year 5. And so what's the scale of that? We'll just give you some idea of the scale of that. So $114 million in year 1. The provincial government in the most recent fiscal year allocated about $74 million to early learning and childcare. So that federal investment of $114 million in the initial year, that really shows the scale. And when you think about that moving to $315 million, $316 million, you can see how the level of funding is increasing. And just to emphasize, the investments that are included in the Canada System Building Agreement, the agreement signed on August the 13th. They are in addition to the federal investments that were already flowing through what we call the bilateral agreement. So the multilateral agreement that was signed nationally in 2017 resulted in a series of bilateral agreements. Saskatchewan is on the third of its set of bilateral agreements. And so that money is still in place. And the hope is that jurisdictions will use the bilateral money. So Saskatchewan's been receiving about $14 million a year under that bilateral agreement. That bilateral agreement money will also be used to support system building. So there'll be a kind of an integration of money that's coming through the system building agreement, the big money, if you like, with the existing money that's coming through the bilateral agreement. And we've already seen one commitment of that where that money has been consolidated in terms of the wage enhancements that were announced in November. So the federal funding, two streams, hopefully they will be consolidated. And when we look at the agreement itself, what's absolutely clear is that the Saskatchewan government in the agreement is committing to system building, to early learning and childcare system building. And that's really important, as Don said, because what we're talking about is we're talking about a very significant change culturally, politically, technically, in how we organize, finance, and deliver early learning and childcare in the sense of moving from a market-based system to more of a publicly funded and managed system. So that's a very important change. And then again, the initial action plan, 2 years, and that's the standard kind of format. If you look across the agreements, the initial action plans are always for a shorter term than a longer term. So the initial 2-year agreement. In that initial action plan, what we see is investments of just under $295 million that will be allocated. So if I can get the next slide, please, Don. So how are those monies going to be allocated? And this is the more detailed part of the agreement. And so this is what you see. Slide's gone, Don. I don't know. Okay, I'll just keep talking and hope the slide and we'll come back up. So in this initial action plan, the 2-year action plan, we've got an investment of, oh good, it's back, as if by magic. We've got initial investment of $295 million. And this is the kind of like the plan that outlines how will Saskatchewan allocate federal monies in terms of the major areas of priority. And you see them outlined there: affordability, as Don said, access, inclusion, quality, and then a reference also to administration and reporting. So how will Saskatchewan, during the first 2 years of this 5-year agreement, how will it actually allocate the federal money? And so if you look at the slide, what you'll see is that, not surprisingly, affordability is the major area of investment. So if you look at the top bullet there, of affordability in the next 2 years, the provincial government is saying it's going to allocate $219 million of the $295 federal million in funding to actual affordability. And the focus is on reducing parent fees. And so you've seen that already with the commitment and the introduction of this parent fee reduction grants. Now, these parent fee reduction grants initially are intended to reduce parent fees in the current fiscal year by, on average, 50%. And over time, it's anticipated that we'll get to an average parent paid portion of the fee of around $10 a day. And if you look at the $219 million, that represents 75% of the $294 million. So the bulk of the monies are allocated to affordability. And I think that's really, I mean, there's two ways of thinking about that. One, we know the importance of affordability for parents. That there's what we call an elasticity of demand. So if childcare fees, the parent paid portion rises, then parents find it very difficult to access childcare. And so childcare must be affordable for allow parents to access. But also, I think from a political standpoint, both certainly the federal government and the provincial governments, they've got a lot riding on. The emphasis is that they're actually reducing parent fees, making them more affordable. So I think that's the political piece of it. But as Don said, affordability is only part of building a system. It's an important part, but it's only one part. The second bullet, in terms of access, what the provincial government has done is allocated just under $50 million of the first 2 years, that 294, allocated $50 million to expansion. Space creation is the old term that we used to use. And what the provincial government's done is actually set out some very aspirational, some very ambitious targets. So in the first 2 years of the agreement, they're looking at creating 12,100 new spaces, which is a very significant amount. If you look at the actual current level of service, we're talking around 17,600 regulated spaces. That includes center-based spaces and family day homes. So that 12,100 in the first 2 years, that's a very significant level of expansion. I would suggest it's probably more aspirational than technically possible, because that's a very significant increase. And then if you look over the length of the agreement, the 5 years of the agreement, what the provincial government has agreed to or committed to is to create 28,000 new spaces. So again, so if you're going from 17,600 in advance of the agreement, over the next 5 years, we're looking at creating 28,000 new spaces. And as all of you know, creating childcare spaces is not simply a matter of saying to an organization, here's some money, go out and build a center and staff it and deliver a service. It's about integrating expansion with the workforce and quality. So there's some very interesting things going to happen around space creation, I think, over the next 5 years. And so there's lots of need to think about that. And then again, in December, the initial announcement was made that there's going to be 601 new spaces in 20 communities. And those, I think it's probably fair to say that those spaces were spaces that were already in the pipeline, if you like, in terms of being planned and supported for development. And so we're out of the gate, but improving parents' access through expansion is going to be a very important part of the agreement. But again, look at the $50 million that's been allocated there, and think about that 12,100 spaces initially in the first 2 years. That works out to just over $4,000, $4,100 per space. So what is the capacity to create 12,100 new spaces with an allocation of $4,100 per space? There's some questions about that. The third area that's identified is inclusion. And this, within the agreement itself, within the action plan, this is a very broad definition of inclusion, which I think is correct. I mean, I think when we used to think about inclusion, we used to think primarily about children with exceptional needs, but inclusion now within this action plan, within the agreement, is much more broadly cast. It includes reflecting on diverse cultural groups. It includes reference to vulnerable children and families in terms of economic and social marginalization. So it's a very broad category. And so $4 million allocated to inclusion over the next years. And there's not a lot of details in the action plan about how that will actually then proceed. So, and then the fourth area identified quality, $15.7 million, again, within that first 2 years to support areas of quality. And in talking about quality, provincial government it's got some good language in there in terms of about quality. It references the play and exploration early learning program guide. It talks about the importance of early child educators and the workforce. And the majority of that money, 15.7, is being allocated very broadly to 3 areas. It's about increasing support for ECEs, including commitments to compensation. And we've seen an initial investment in wage enhancements, which I think is a little bit bumpy, and you will have a better sense that perhaps that wasn't necessarily well rolled out. But there are also commitments to building the size of the workforce. Again, if you look at that bullet number 2, if we're talking about creating 12,100 new spaces, then we have to be thinking very seriously about who are the early child educators, who are the well-supported, well-prepared, well-compensated early child educators who are going to make those spaces come alive. So there's some commitment to recruitment and retention, and then there's also a commitment to continuous professional learning and skill development. And what I would suggest to you, if I stand back a little bit and I look at that money that's been enveloped, that $15.7 million, it doesn't seem sufficient to support significant increases in compensation, the ECEs. It does not seem sufficient to build the capacity of the workforce through recruiting and retaining more and better qualified staff. And it certainly doesn't seem to cover all of the needs that have been raised. So if I stand back and I look at that initial action plan, I think I appreciate the areas of emphasis. I appreciate the detail in terms of allocating budgeted amounts in fiscal envelopes. But in that final point, what we're saying is these are really initial steps for system building. And in some ways, what's happened is, I think, and it's not unique to Saskatchewan, governments have come out of the initial implementation in a rather hurried fashion. So I think there's some question about whether that parent fee reduction grant calculating that on the average provincial fee, was that the best way of calculating a grant to support affordability for parents? Was that the best way? And the same in terms of thinking about the initial investments in compensation. Was that the best way to start out with that $1, $2, $3 enhancements? Was that the best way to begin thinking through compensation? So what we're anticipating is that this is the initial action plan, and throughout the action plan, what you will see is you will see numerous references in terms of respect to access, to inclusion, and to quality. You'll see numerous references where the provincial government said, you know what, this is our attempt to come out of the gate and get the process moving, but over time, and perhaps as we move from action plan 1 to action plan 2, we are committed to consulting and engaging with stakeholders. And I think that's going to be absolutely critical in terms of building a system. So can I get the next slide, please, Tom? So that really brings us to the roadmap, because what the roadmap, as Don said in his introductory remarks, was what the roadmap was really intended to do was to think through how does the Saskatchewan province, the government, working in partnership with the early learning and childcare sector and other stakeholders, how does it actually go about building an early learning and childcare system? And so what we're talking about here is very significant change in how we organize, finance, and deliver early learning and childcare services. And Morna is going to speak to those changes in much more detail. But this is Don used the words, and the words are in the federal budget documents. This is about transformational change. So when the budget was announced in April, and Don was absolutely right, I was one of the many people in the budget lockup, and I think when we saw the level of federal investments, we were very pleasantly surprised. And so after that budget announcement came down, the 6 partners who you see represented there, the Canadian Childcare Federation and Saskatchewan Leaders Caucus, and we've got some Leaders Caucus members on the webinar today. Childcare Now, and it's relatively new Saskatchewan chapter, and then SACA, which has been a very strong voice and advocate for the field over the last decade and more. And then the Muttart Foundation, we said what we might want to do is we might want to think through how can the early learning and childcare sector itself and its supporters, how can we start outlining or presenting what's possible in terms of building a system in early learning and childcare in Saskatchewan? How can we outline what's possible, and how can we speak to what's necessary to actually transform what we currently have in terms of a market-based model into a more publicly managed and financed systems? And so as Don said, the roadmap partners, we got together and we said, well, let's think through how stakeholders can identify and put on paper options and scenarios and recommended actions for moving forward towards a system. And so over the summer, as Don mentioned, and I would hope that, or I would imagine that many of you were part of those engagements, we worked with Jane Beach, who's a longtime consultant in the early learning childcare. Many of you will have seen her work. And we worked with Jane Beach through a series of virtual engagements, and we asked stakeholders to consider key elements of system building. What is it that we mean by system building? And what is it that needs to take place to support system building? We looked at affordability, we looked at access, we looked at the workforce, but we also looked specifically at what publicly managed early learning and childcare systems actually look like. What do they involve? What do they include? What are their characteristics? What are their cultural values? What are their technical elements? And the one good thing about coming late to this field, so as you know, Canada is one of the international jurisdictions that's been relatively late in moving towards a system approach to early learning childcare. One of the good things about coming to the party late, if you like, is we've actually got a lot of research that we can look at. We can look at examples of systems from other jurisdictions, and we can get a real sense of what do those systems look like? Well, what are their structural characteristics? How do they operate? What are their features? And so as part of the roadmap work over the summer, we brought stakeholders together. We talked about the key elements of systems. And then we talked about what are the features and characteristics that need to be attended to. And so that resulted, and as Don said, with the roadmap was actually produced, I think it actually came out right at the end of October, towards the end of October. And the roadmap outlines 27 different policy actions. I know that's a lot. And so, 27, is that a lot? Yes, it is a lot, but it's probably also not the full range of policy actions that are needed to transform from a sector, an early learning and childcare sector, into a system. And so what the policy roadmap does, it outlines four main areas where we think changes are needed. And in terms of the changes in those four main areas, so it's ideas and vision, and Morna's going to speak to these in much more detail, public policy, planning and management, financing, and workforce development and support. And in those four areas, which are essentially integrated, the kind of changes that take place within a sequence and a dynamic environment where lots of things are changing at the same time, okay? It's not a matter of just making one change in one particular area and saying we're done. It's a matter of thinking together, how do we make changes in all of those areas? In some ways, perhaps all at the same time, but in ways that make sense. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to build a system while we're also delivering services through a sector. So it's not, we can't say we're going to close down the early learning and childcare sector in Saskatchewan for 2 years. We're going to rearrange things. We're going to come back with a new model, and then we'll reopen in 2 years' time. We've got to build a system at the same time that we're delivering services. So it's kind of like the wonderful scenario. We've all been through this. I went through this many years ago, where you're trying to renovating a house while you're living in it, right? And you're thinking, well, maybe we can renovate a bathroom, and maybe we'll focus on the bathroom, and we'll do that, and the rest of the house will be okay. Bathroom's okay. Probably get by if you've got 2 bathrooms. If you're doing your kitchen and your bathroom, you've got a bit of a problem. If you're doing your kitchen and your bathroom and your bedrooms and your main floor, this is really complex work. And so when we think about the nature of the change that's taking place, if we get to the bottom there, what we recognize is that transformational change is required to move from a sector to a system. But that transformational change is going to take a lot of time, it's complex, and it's going to really require the input of many, many different stakeholders on an ongoing basis. So this is the proposition that's before us. It's an exciting proposition, but it's a daunting proposition. So I'm just going to turn it over to Morna, who's going to talk through in more detail the roadmap itself. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Chris. First of all, I want to let you all know that I'm joining you from Ottawa, and want to acknowledge that Ottawa is built on the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I'm just going to pick up the story where Chris left off, and that's the story of this roadmap that we worked hard to develop. And to emphasize the point that Chris made is that we're really in looking at what kind of a system we need for Saskatchewan. We're not really starting from scratch, as he pointed out. First of all, we have what you could call it a system or not a system, but certainly we have early learning and childcare in Saskatchewan. But we also have all kinds of experience, particularly from other countries, with respect to what a high quality early learning and childcare system can look like. Sometimes it's hard when you're working in a sector to imagine it differently than the way it is organized. And that's when it's useful to look to other countries, other jurisdictions to say, well, how are you doing things? And also look at the body of research and evidence that has been collected and analyzed through international organizations like UNICEF and like OECD. So we, in developing the roadmap for Saskatchewan, we looked at what are some features or elements that high quality early learning and childcare systems have in common. And these are summarized in just the 5 points on your screen. And they're of course expanded in the document itself, which you can get as a handout. So very critical in jurisdictions that have high quality early learning and childcare systems. Early learning and childcare is actually recognized and treated as a public good. So what do we mean by public good? Well, a public good is something that's made available to all citizens. That's sort of an essential element of what a public good is. And typically, a public good is delivered or is organized or facilitated by government, and it's paid for collectively through taxes. That's kind of a broad definition of public good. So we don't actually have that in Canada when it comes to early learning and childcare. But countries that have high quality systems actually treat early learning and childcare as a public good. Another central element or feature is public planning and management of services instead of the reliance on childcare markets. And Chris has also referred to this already. What do we mean by public planning and management? Again, usually what public means is government. That government actually assumes the role and responsibility for the supply of early learning and childcare, or at least assumes responsibility to ensure that there is sufficient supply so that all have access to it, and also that the supply is of high quality and is in the interests of the public and those who directly are engaged and involved in early learning and childcare. A third element, which of course it goes beyond planning and management, is public funding. So as I said, typically a public good is one that is paid for collectively. And we know from jurisdictions that have high quality systems, governments fund using public funds. They fund the services and the infrastructure. And rather than rely on parent fees or other private sources of revenue, like fundraising, for example, you don't have to have bake sales when you have a publicly funded system in order to be able to ensure that you have really safe, high quality early learning environments, for example. The other central feature we know from other jurisdictions is high quality systems require well-prepared, fairly compensated, professional early childhood educators whose work is valued and respected. You cannot have a quality system without that, and I'm sure I don't have to tell you the truth of that statement. And also importantly, because high quality early learning and childcare systems are always public systems, there has to be ongoing, meaningful public input and engagement, particularly engagement of parents and those who work in the sector, and in not just developing the systems, but making sure that they're constantly changing in the interest and for the benefit of the public, and there has to be public accountability. So we, in building our roadmap, started off by how do you integrate those key elements into what we're proposing for Saskatchewan. Now, I'm going to summarize in 2 slides what's actually, I think, about 22 pages of text in the roadmap, and I am not going to do it justice. I'm only going to be able to highlight, hopefully, if you haven't read the roadmap yet, pique your interest and curiosity about the detail, because really the richness of the document is actually in the detail, especially those sections that deal with the kinds of concerns I'm sure you are very foremost in your minds, and that's around workforce development and support, and also supports to ensure quality programs can be maintained. Our roadmap is divided, as Chris said, 27 policy actions are summarized in this roadmap that we're making to government. And as Chris said, that's only the start. And we think actually that as this roadmap gets out there and there's discussions like on this webinar, we might very well be adding and refining some of these policy action recommendations that are included in the document. So trying to get through this relatively quickly, and as I said, not doing it entire justice. So first of all, what we're proposing is that building a high quality early learning and childcare system in Saskatchewan, which, as Chris said, the Saskatchewan government committed to doing so, requires a new vision and guiding principles for early learning and childcare in the province. And in this respect, we have 2 main policy actions. We want the Saskatchewan government to articulate in writing, on paper, and revise, prepare, it already has a vision, to prepare a new vision and guiding principles for early learning and childcare. And we think that there has to be a very explicit commitment to high quality, accessible, and affordable early learning and childcare for all children and their families. And so therefore a commitment to universality with respect to access, and also an understanding and a commitment to everything that goes in to ensuring that it's a high quality system. So, you know, leaning on the elements that I just went through in the previous slide, including the early childhood educators are well educated, fairly compensated, and have good working conditions. Also, we think it's absolutely essential as part of this vision that the government articulate support for Indigenous self-determination with respect to early learning and childcare. There's an obligation on all of us, but particularly on governments, to follow through on the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, also the recommendations in the inquiry into the murdered and disappeared Indigenous girls and women, and also, of course, that every jurisdiction respect and abide by the Indigenous Early Learning and Childcare Framework Agreement that Dawn referred to. We're also saying that it's important for the Saskatchewan government to make these commitments and in legislation. That we need the legislation that exists now in the province to be reworked, reintroduced, and adopted so that these commitments are actually commitments made in law. The other, going back, as I said, one of the key elements is around public management and funding and so forth of services. So another area that key area of the roadmap addresses what is required to actually make real the public management of services, of early learning and childcare services, and the planning of those services. In that respect, there are 10 recommended policy actions. Again, I'm just going to really just briefly summarize those. One of the things that we think needs to happen is that the Ministry of Education, the Saskatchewan government, actually has to put in place the infrastructure and work across government to ensure that the system is being built and planned, and that there is in fact the support at a government level for the management of early learning and childcare services. It really has been left, the management of the supply and the provision of childcare services has really been left to you on this webinar and others, to individuals, whether it's individuals or organizations made up of individuals have really been the ones that have had to manage as best you can, often in isolation, of course within parameters set by government legislation, and of course there's some public funding, but we want to move the onus on individuals and private entities, even if they're not-for-profit entities, for the supply and management of the service, and put it on the government's plate. To be able to expand to the extent, like Chris mentioned, the expansion targets being extremely ambitious, 12,100 new spaces in the first phase, and 28,000 new spaces by 25-26. What we're saying is that what's required is a multi-year expansion strategy. So, it's going to take a little time to develop the expansion strategy. It's not necessarily a problem for the government to go ahead and just, go ahead, pursue the licensing and processing of applications for licenses that are received for expansions, but that isn't really the way we want to see expansion. We want to see planned expansion, and we want to make sure that the planned expansion is in response to needs that have been identified, and part of the planning of expansion that is done in such a way that all the obstacles that might be in the way of expanding in one geographic area or another, or expansion of provision of a certain type or age group, all of those obstacles are addressed in systems, from a systems point of view, that's part of what we want to see. We don't want to see sort of the continuation of how expansion has been to date, which is really kind of application based as opposed to the government taking proactive steps to make sure that childcare, early learning and childcare services are located where they are needed. They serve families, children where they are needed most, and so forth. And also importantly, we make recommendations that there has to, as I said earlier, be public input and participation of those of you who know the sector the best, or those of you who work in the sector. So Dawn, I think we need to go on to the next. A bunch of policy actions around financing, and I just want to focus on sort of some of the basic ones, the basic things that we are calling for. And they're going to be obvious probably to you. What we want is that the public governments fund fully and directly regulated licensed services, that the funding of services no longer depends on parent fees coming in, and that providers are no longer have to go get money from parents in the form of fees to be able to operate a program. So we want full and direct funding. We don't want public funding to continue to wind its way to the services through parent fee subsidies. We want the supply to be funded. We want supply side funding, not demand side funding. And we want the funding that is provided, this funding, public funding, to be based on real needs, real cost needs for high quality programming. So, you know, in a number of jurisdictions, for example, their governments are moving towards making childcare more affordable for families by lowering the fees and then replacing the parent fee income revenue that would, you know, go down as a result of fees going down, replacing it with public funds going directly to services in the form of operational grants, and they're going by different names in different jurisdictions. The problem with this approach is it assumes that the revenue that is being received by parent fees is actually sufficient to be able to have a high quality program. So what we're saying, don't assume that. What we want are funding formulas that actually recognize the real costs of delivering high quality programs, and that includes the real costs of proper compensation to be able to retain, recruit a qualified workforce. And that brings me to, and also just with respect to the financing and parent fees, is that we recognize that even the ambitious target of bringing down parent fees to an average of $10 a day, that fee is still will still make childcare unaffordable for many families, especially families with more than one child, but for low-income families. And so what we also want to make sure that there are measures taken by governments to ensure real affordability. But again, that doesn't necessarily have to be done through a parent fee subsidy system. That means that the fees that are being charged to help supplement public funding or to help compensate for the public funding, that they're actually geared to income, to household income. Very importantly, the roadmap outlines 7 policy actions that relate to workforce development and support. Now, we know from all the research, all the evidence from other jurisdictions and from Canada, from every jurisdiction in Canada, that a main predictor of a quality program are the qualifications and the support that early childhood educators have. So workforce development and support is the critical piece to building a high quality system. So within that respect, and again, I'm not going to do it justice, and this is might be the section that interests you most of our roadmap, but we are advocating in that document for funding support for early childhood educators' education and ongoing professional learning. We think that there need to be very comprehensive strategies developed and deployed by the government to raise pre-service educational requirements for ECEs and also for family childcare providers. And we, this won't be surprising to you, we in the roadmap advocate for a competitive provincial salary scale for early childhood educators, and that this be developed very carefully, including what is needed when we say competitive, what is needed in order to be able to recruit and retain early childhood educators at a time where other sectors, particularly the care sector of the economy, are getting upgrades, and where there is attention being paid to the workforce. So when salary increases, when there are salary increases in other sectors, if the early childhood educator sector does not get similar or better increases, we are going to lose more and more staff to other sectors of the economy. And of course, important part of that is improvements to broadly speaking, working conditions. So everything from making sure that early childhood educators have paid preparation time, that there's sufficient, that the ratios are adjusted, that there are sufficient qualified staff on the floor, that there's also that those who are administering, the directors and others, the infrastructure of centers, the attention is also paid to their working conditions. And so again, as I say, the roadmap has a lot of very detailed recommendations, and I really urge you to look at those and add to them, discuss them, think about where they're weak, think about where they could be enhanced, because this roadmap, and Don's going to be talking about this, we see it as a living document, one that is going to need constant improvement and constant revisions as we move forward with system building. So Don, over to you.
Great, thanks Morna. Thanks Chris, that's fantastic. And I hope, and I'm sure you all are realizing this isn't just about a fresh coat of paint. This is about transformative changes, as I've said, as Chris has said, as Morna has said. And maybe another apt description is it's not about just shuffling the deck chairs. That's something that I've heard a lot across Canada, and or when other jurisdictions have engaged in better system building than what they had. This is rethinking and re-envisioning how we do childcare, as Morna and Chris have just talked about. And it's so important then in terms of how do we go forward with this, and how do we move all of us collectively. And so this is part of that process, right? Part of this process is about engaging all of you, and we're going to engage more. I appreciate that most of you are directors out there. You're running programs. You're living the reality of the staffing and of the administration. I know all about the spreadsheets that you're having to fill out with regards to fees for families, and how that's looking for you, and the work that goes into that. And so we're going to be, as next steps, talking to the sector at large next week, and many other pieces. Morna talked about that democratic participation, and childcare doesn't work in isolation, right? It works in a larger ecosystem that has many different players at the table, and people that have, and organizations and sectors that have an interest, a very significant interest in the success of a childcare system. And so we're going to do that. And we have shared this document with Minister Duncan and with Premier Moe. We have shared this with the Prime Minister and with Minister Karina Gould, who is the federal minister responsible for early learning and childcare. So this is there, and we're continuing that work nationally as well as provincially, because as I think Chris said it and Morna said it as well, this is really where the hard work begins. And you've all been doing hard work, but this is more hard work that has to happen so that we get this right. It is going to take time, as we've talked about. Again, Saskatchewan has made some first steps. There's no doubt about that. But as we've talked about here, are those the right steps? Are those the long-term steps that are going to bring about change for everybody? And I'm going to tie this back to what I said in my first comments, that there's a certain level of commentary out there that says, oh, you're continually talking about the same things over and over again. Well, yes, we are, because we've never solved those things. This is the opportunity to solve those things. And so we have to think critically about where we're at today and how we get to a better place. And again, this is about really rethinking. Morna said it so well, that childcare has been that sector where you make individual decisions as a program, maybe to expand, maybe to not, in terms of your salaries, in terms of your working conditions for your program, in terms of services for your community, things like that. So in other words, they're done generally in isolation and one-off decisions. This is about thinking broader than that. And I always bring this parallel to it, and I'm not suggesting to you it's a perfect system, but let's look at education. Let's look at education and start with this. Where, as the pandemic started and as it's continued to go, education system continues to pay teachers, continues to pay and support children and families, maybe not perfectly again. And, we certainly moved to remote learning. It's happening still in other areas. I know in Saskatchewan, everybody went back to school in class, and lots of debate whether that should or shouldn't be. But the point is they had a system behind them, and they're not just making one-off decisions as you have all had to make through the pandemic. And it's in terms of also how they get funded, right? They have a full supply side of funding. And so something we have to think about in terms of how you fund a service, as Morna and Chris have talked about. And so we need to take those realities that we're facing today and reimagine them and rethink them with this document behind us, as to how we can break those current ways of thinking, those current practices that are happening right now, not just in Saskatchewan, but across Canada, and build a high quality system. It is such important work. Your work has always been so important. You know this. We need to get to that place where everybody knows this, and we certainly have great buy-in from the federal government. We have buy-in from provincial governments. Now we need to articulate that and move that just from a buy-in to actually building it. So I'm going to just, Chris and Morna, just open up the questions here, and I'm going to stop sharing. And like I said earlier, and Georgia said, we're going to share all this information with you. So don't worry about that. And I'm just going to go into the questions here and see if we have any. All right. Bear with me as I look at these. Is there a place to find the grants available in application forms? And just on that, I think, Georgia, if you wanted to jump in on that, if you want to make your mic and your, go ahead,
Yeah,
Georgia.
absolutely. Okay, so all of that information in regards to the parent fee reduction and reimbursements, as well as the wage enhancements, that all should have come from your consultant. So definitely reach out to your consultant if you have not received that information yet. It went out a few months ago, a couple months ago, I guess now. So I would just recommend reaching out to your consultant.
Okay, great. I'm just going to jump ahead here. Chris, someone is asking the question, and Morna, this is for you as well. We have parallel questions here. And I know you talked about it a little bit, but perhaps if you could expand. So Chris, starting with you, could you just expand a little bit on the role of yourself and Muttart through the whole roadmap and the initiative, and maybe Morna, not just maybe Morna, if you can answer the same question. I know you both touched on it earlier, but if you wouldn't mind just expanding on that a bit more, that would be appreciated.
Okay, thanks, Donnie, and thanks for the question. So the Muttart Foundation, we're a private charitable foundation. We're based in Edmonton, Alberta, and we fund in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Then we also fund nationally. And what we're really interested in early living and childcare for many of the reasons that Morna talked about, we do see early learning childcare as a public good. We see this as something that if it's invested in publicly and delivered well, then the benefits flow to children. Absolutely, these are programs for children, but they're also a program for families and they're programs for the broader community. So we're really interested in that. So as part of the roadmap, what we were very aware of and had a really good chance to work with Georgia, Dawn, Mona, Karen, Nicole over the last few years. And what we're all aware of is that there is the need for significant policy change. And policy change, sometimes I think when we talk about policies, I think we have two sort of areas. We're all pretty good at saying when we see an individual need for an individual family, how do we help? How do we support that family? And we're all particularly good, perhaps talking then at the very broad values level, and we say things very generally, well, yes, all families should have access to high quality, affordable childcare. But what do the policies look like that actually make that happen? How do we move from the individual and the very broad collective to that policy level landscape? So what Muttart, our work is looking at policy. We're interested in how do we develop better policies that, as Don said, that address the long-term problems. I mean, I've been working now in this field for close to 2 decades, some of you longer. What's so frustrating is that some of the same challenges we identified 20 years ago around the workforce about recruitment and retention, delivery of high quality care, they're still there. And they're still there because what we've done is we've said to individuals, you fix it. You fix the problems around recruiting and retaining staff, but centers can do a certain amount, and directors, you've done way more than we're entitled to expect you to do. But the longer term fixes, the longer term solutions require better public policy. And as Mona talked about the system building, what the system building is about, what system building is at its essence, is about good public policy that supports the organization, financing, and delivery of services. So that doesn't mean that centers on an ongoing basis are facing the same challenges that they faced 1 year ago, 3 years ago, and 5 years ago. Now that doesn't remove, if you like, that innovation, that spirit, that character that you bring to services, but it provides you with a basis. So Muttart Foundation, we're interested in public policy. And working with Dawn and Mona and Georgia and Nicole and Karen over the last 5 years, what we've seen is we've seen governments, particularly at the federal level, we've seen governments start to, if you like, accept some of the arguments that those of you who know Martha and Friendly and Co have been advancing these arguments for 25 years. Governments have come around, and over the last 2 years federally, I've had the privilege of seeing both Mona and Dawn and others speak directly to the federal government. And the federal government, I think, has been seized by the potential for early learning childcare. So Muttart's interested in public policy, and I think the opportunity now to get that public policy right is before us. But getting public policy right isn't just a technical exercise. It means engaging the community, the early learning childcare community and other stakeholders, and saying, what is important for us in early learning childcare? Early learning childcare should be informed by values. If we don't have values when we're talking about children and families and their development, when do we have values? So the Muttart's role is to bring people together to talk about policy and advance those policy changes. We can provide some expertise and support, but what we all need is we all need the commitment of you as the stakeholders in the field to make that happen. So I'm just going to stop there, and thanks, Tom.
Yep. Mona, over to you. Same question.
Yeah, well, I'll just say, you know, Chris said it all. I'll just explain that Childcare Now, which is Canada's National Childcare Advocacy Association, we were founded in 1982 as an umbrella organization of individuals and organizations who wanted to see a system of early learning and childcare built in Canada. So this has been something we've been working on for decades as an organization. And we were, of course, worked hard to get the breakthrough of the federal budget in 2021. But we recognize that although as an organization, nationally, our focus has been very much on the federal government, because we really never thought that a proper early learning and childcare system could be built in Canada without the federal government. For one thing, the federal government has greater fiscal capacity. In other words, it has more money and can raise more money than any other level of government. The simple reason that it collects taxes from everybody, not just from those who live in one jurisdiction. And also, we wanted the federal government to play a major role in building a system, because it was the only way to ensure that somebody's access to high quality program, or that the working conditions and compensation of those who work in the system aren't dependent on not just the fiscal capacity, but also the politics of an individual provincial government. And we also wanted to make sure that there was equity across the country. But the federal government, at the same time, under our constitution, it is the provinces and the territories, those governments, that actually decide how the system should be organized and funded, certainly on a day-to-day basis. And so we knew that although the federal government stepped up, although it was going to be handing over the $30 billion, we wanted to make sure that in every province and every territory, there was a roadmap for how that should happen, how that money should be used in each jurisdiction. And we wanted to play a role in bringing not just the sector, those who work in the sector together, but those who work in the sector together with those who don't. Because I am absolutely convinced that the only way that a public system can be supported and sustained is if it has public support, broad public support. And as long as early learning and childcare is just seen as an issue that people who work in the sector care about, I'm worried that it's just going to end up, we're not going to make as much progress as we need to make. So that's been our involvement, as the roadmap is in part important, and involvement was trying to set an agenda or help influence the agenda of the provincial government, but also seen as kind of a mechanism itself in bringing people together and serving as kind of a launching point for broad public discussion about what kind of system every province needs, in this case, what Saskatchewan needs, and how to make sure that it's built in such a way that it's good for children, that it's good for parents, particularly mothers, and serves as an important bridge to the paid workforce, and because that's the only way we're going to be able to have economic security for women and gender equity, but also is done in such a way that it really contributes to vibrant local economies. And we think we can achieve all of that, but to do that, we really need broad public engagement.
Thanks, Morna. And I think it's important to note as well there, when you were speaking of roadmaps, Muttart Foundation and Childcare Now and the Federation, Canadian Childcare Federation, were also did a similar parallel process in Alberta. So there is a roadmap in Alberta as well. There was one developed in BC. We weren't as intimately involved in that, but there's one there in BC. There's one in Ontario, and there's one being developed currently that we are involved with, the three of us again, in Manitoba. So as Morna said, like, we're working hard and supporting wherever we can the development of roadmaps, no matter the jurisdiction in Canada. And it wouldn't shock any one of you to know that they're very similar to each other, because the issues are the same, right? So maybe, Morna, I can put you on the spot again for this next one, because this is a question that I know you and Chris and many others, myself included, have had this one a lot. This is from somebody who said, or was asked, that they run an ELCC program. It's an early learning center. It's not a childcare program, but a pre-kindergarten program that is currently being funded by the Ministry of Education in Saskatchewan. How does the childcare plan work for all? Because that is an important part of this in terms of, like, when we say building a system. So if you want to speak to that, please, Morna.
Well, we see early learning and childcare pretty holistically. We've always said that early learning and childcare, or childcare, should be universally available, should be high quality for all children from birth to age 12, and that it can't ever be, a system of early learning and childcare cannot ever be developed in isolation of other systems that support the development and well-being of children and families, and of working parents who are in the paid labor force. So, for example, we think that it's important in developing a system of early learning and childcare that we take into account systems like maternity and parental leave systems, to make sure that those are in place to also support families with, who have newborn children and in at least the first 12 months of their lives. And we also think that the system needs to be built alongside and complementary to the public education system. And that means that we really, and we think early learning and childcare, early childhood education is education, and it needs to be regarded as that. So what we're looking for in Saskatchewan, and what we're looking for in every jurisdiction, is that a much broader, more holistic approach be taken to make sure that children, that the early learning and childcare programs, that the childcare programs are developed and the system is developed in a way that makes sense and is integrated and seamless with the public education system. We also think that if there's going to be, and I know, Chris, you'll be able to expand on a lot of these points and probably be more specific in the reply to the question, but we also think it's going to be, to have the expansion that we need, we're going to have to look at all avenues to serve as places of early learning and childcare. So we think that there are going to be a lot more partners required than those who are already providing early learning and childcare programs. So we want to see, for example, schools involved. We want to see the public education system involved. We want to see more schools as places of early learning and supporting, perhaps in a better way, early learning. And we also want to see other other levels of government, like municipalities, involved. So our organization has always called for a comprehensive system of early learning and childcare. We don't advocate one model over another. We're strong supporters of community-based programs. We're also strong supporters of kindergarten as part of the public education system, of before and after school programs, and we're strong supporters of school age programs, both delivered by, as part of the public education and on-site in schools and also in the community. But what we're saying is, wherever the programs are delivered, they have to be delivered with the interests of children at heart, first and foremost. They have to be developed and supported in a way that makes sense for child. They also have to keep in mind that the needs of working parents. I can't say working, but what I really mean is working in the paid labor force, because we know there are lots of mothers particularly who are working hard but not necessarily getting paid for the labor. And school programs, because of the length of the day, don't necessarily do that. So all of that, so that's what we're looking for. So others may be able to answer this more specifically. Don?
No, thanks, Morna. And I think that is, one of the fundamental pieces that we're all talking about is when you build a system, to actually talk about some of those points that come back at us as a sector, that it's one size fits all and it doesn't respect choice, and those narratives that have been put back on the sector. That's why we want to build a system, or why we need to build a system, is because it actually does support choice, and it actually does support flexibility, right? Because right now our sector is structured such as the majority of spaces, the vast majority of spaces, are Monday to Friday, kind of 9 to 5 kind of tip, or 7 to 3, whatever it happens to be. That's not a system. That's a market. And we understand why programs are done that way. This is about turning that on its head and creating flexibility and creating opportunities for families and for children, as Morna said. That in a well-functioning system, high-functioning system, if the family has decides that one parent or one of somebody stays at home, there should still be opportunities, accessible, high quality opportunities for children to access high quality early learning. It's not just about one size fits all. It really, really isn't. So I just want to pick up on that, because there's a question here. Chris, this is to you, because this has come up in Alberta. What about school age? What about before and after school and care and summer care? Where is that within the plan? And certainly maybe even talk a little bit about, what the federal government has or has not said, more apropos about school age care.
Yeah, thanks. And I really appreciate that question about out of school care, because as Morna said, when you're looking at a system of early learning and childcare, when you're thinking about it publicly managing and planning it, you integrate and connect that system with parental leave, you integrate and connect that system with the public education system. And so these systems, they need to interface. And so I think one of the oversights at the federal government, if you like, in terms of the current initiative, is that the focus is on children 0 to 6, and that's standard across the country. But again, as you know in Saskatchewan, and we know in Alberta, 5-year-olds in Alberta attend part-day K programs, right? We also have part-day pre-K programs. 5-year-olds in Ontario are in full-day K programs. Now it's a 6 or 7 hour, it's not a full day, it's not a 9-hour day, but essentially what we're looking at in terms of the early learning and childcare system, this initial phase is children 0 to 6. But what I would say to the provincial governments is, and this is what Morna referenced in the roadmap, we talk about a whole of government approach to thinking about early learning and childcare. So in thinking about early learning and childcare with a whole of government approach, you should be thinking about what does your public education system look like? What does your public education currently do in terms of its support for children who are 4 and 5 years of age? Why in Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan do we have part-day kindergarten program where every other province has full-day kindergarten program? What is it that's so unique about children in Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan that said that they need a part-day program as opposed to a 6-hour program? So the answer is to focus on the integration of an early learning and childcare system with the public education system, also recognizing the critical role of out-of-school care. Now, the federal government in the budget did make commitments to look at out-of-school care, but that's an area I think that's really important to be brought forward by the sector itself. We need to say that we're not trying to prejudice or support for children 0 to 6 and say, by the way, when they're 7, 8, 9, and 10, you're on your own, folks, because that's not how integrated system works. So it's about integrating those systems that make sense within the province, but also bringing together the different ministries. So in the roadmap, you will see reference to the whole of government approach. All of government should be concerned about early learning and childcare, and all of government should be thinking about how those systems of public education, early learning and childcare, how do they connect? We should not be leaving out children and families. And so it's a big long-term process. It's a bigger narrative. But I think what Don and Morna have said is the federal government has provided the opportunity, if you like, to address one of the areas that's been most underdeveloped, 0 to 6, but one of the areas that's also most underdeveloped is out-of-school care. We need to think through how do we connect out-of-school care to early learning and childcare and public education in ways that make sense. And as Morna said, in the roadmap, you will see a reference to a childcare in schools policy. You'll see reference to thinking about how do we link those publicly funded pre-K programs, the 316 programs with 5,000 little people, how do we connect those to community-based childcare? They should be connected. They should not be viewed as in isolation. So it's part of the bigger discussion, and thank you for raising that point. And that's certainly been a point that's come up in Alberta. And what's interesting is when we think about the federal investments, provincial governments, by the way, you also have your own investments in public education and childcare that you should not be taking off the table. You need to be thinking about how your own investments also complement that. And in the Newfoundland plan, the Newfoundland and Labrador plan, they've actually attended to how do they more closely integrate out of school care using provincial money with early learning and childcare using new federal money. So that's what we need to think. We need to challenge the governments to think big. As Don said, this is about creating a new vision. This is not about doing more of the same with more zeros attached. So I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Can I just add two very short points, Don?
Yeah.
One is that I think that one of the things that we've really suffered from is when we think about this whole question about where does childcare, early learning and childcare programs, where do they fit relative to kindergarten, to pre-kindergarten programs? A lot of the nervousness about this, or what's going to happen if this goes, has to do with the fact that the childcare sector has always been the poor, underfunded cousin. It's been the part of the system for 0 to 12, for around the care of 0 to 12. It's been the programs have had to compete for parent fees. They have been incredibly in a precarious position, and so any change, right, and it has been regarded with suspicion for for good reason, right? And I think this is why it's so important to imagine a fully publicly funded system and all the opportunities that that creates, because I think it's going to reduce competition between programs, and it's going to be then possible for all of us to sort of sit down, if it's fully publicly funded, publicly managed, where everybody is respected, where people are, where those who work in the sector are properly compensated, to think, okay, how could this really, really work better for all of us, right? But we can't do that as long as the sector is being treated so poorly, especially relative to the public education system. So I think that's a really critical piece, that we have to get the funding and see it as a public good, and that will open the way to possibilities. The other thing, just a short note, in 2019, the Liberals, the federal Liberals, promised in the election campaign to create 250,000 school-age spaces, all right? So we have a responsibility as advocates to keep the pressure on the federal government to say, okay, the focus has been on 0 to 6, but you are going to also have to provide support for the out-of-school programs, and school-age programs, that we need to work on that.
Yeah. Thanks, Morna. And yeah, to be really clear and to support Morna's point there, we have not forgotten about school age collectively. We have not. So one more question that I know we're getting to the bottom of the half hour here. And just, there's a lot of questions coming through. Just a reminder again, we will send out a link to the recording of the webinar. We will send out the PDF copy of the slides, and we will also send out, for those of you who don't have it, a copy of the roadmap as well. So that will come to all of you. But there's a question here. I'll start with it if that's okay, Morna and Chris, and then if you could join in as well. Question about how much interaction input do we as partners who developed the roadmap or assisted in developing the roadmap have with government, and I guess in this case Saskatchewan, in terms of influencing their decisions and so on and so forth. So from the Federation, certainly we, CCA is our affiliate, and so we support CCA in the great work that Georgia and the organization has been doing in terms of its relationship building and outreach with the provincial government. We also have funded through the Muttart Foundation what we call our Saskatchewan Leaders Caucus, which is like a think tank, which helps support the work of CCA as well, talking about policy issues and whatnot. And certainly as an organization are jumping in on, well, events like this and conversations with Minister Duncan and others and more to support the work that is going on and support the roadmap that we have shared here with you today. So certainly, we're there. This is a collective push, and not just in Saskatchewan, but across Canada, that we are all lending our voices and time and energy and strategy to on an ongoing basis. So Morna, I'll pass that over to you for your response to that.
Yeah, I would just add to that is that, of course, we're all pursuing collectively and individually, organizations, sort of what we might call inside strategies, trying to get meetings with government and quietly speaking to them, making, on an ongoing basis. But I would say, at least childcare now, one of the things we do is try to keep the issue in the media, as another way of trying to influence government policy shifts. And also, as I say, reaching out to a broad range of organizations to get their support for what's being suggested in the roadmap, and encouraging them to use their influence. I think we all know that one of the reasons that the federal government made the decision it did in the 2021 federal budget and allocate $30 billion is that by that time, at least 6 months in advance, it was clear that every sector of the economy was crying out for the federal government to do something about childcare to improve the situation that everybody. And it was only with that kind of very broad and diverse and organized pressure in the media, public pressure, as well as public conversations, that led to the policy change at the federal level. And I think we're going to continue to do that in every province as well.
And Chris, to you.
Yeah, just a final observations. Really agree with what Mona and Don said, and I think it's really important as stakeholders that we say we've got solutions, we've got ideas, we've got propositions, we've got strategies. So we're bringing forward insights and observations to the table that are based both on personal experience, delivering services, but also an understanding, as Mona said, about the policy landscape in other jurisdictions. So we're bringing forward good ideas, and we want to be actively engaged in the process. And I think, again, governments change, governments come and go in terms of their preferences, but what we need to show as a sector is that we've got good ideas. We've got strategies, we've got observations, and they're well thought through, and they're well considered, and they're supported by a set of constituents. So we need to show what we can bring to the table, and that's the idea of the roadmap. And as Mona said, the roadmap is not the final document. So maybe now we've got some better ideas we can articulate on out of school care, or we can articulate on bigger system integration. And so we need to show governments what we can bring to the table, and we need to argue our corner, and correctly so. Public policy should be political, right? It should be about different interests. Mona talked about public education, ongoing discussions around public education, and so we need to be active participants in presenting policy solutions, policy arguments, and we need to be actively saying to government, we can help you engage in this. We are all in this together. This is about building a public system, and so we need to show that we've got a strong role to play, and we're willing to play it. Will we get everything that we want? No, but that never happens in public policy. But give us a chance to participate fully to the best of our ability. So I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Georgia, over to you.
Yes, absolutely. So I just see that we're a few minutes after 11:30, so I just want to be cognizant of everyone's time. And so, Dawn, did you want to go through any more questions, or can I do closing remarks? Okay, awesome. Well, first off, I'd like to thank all of the participants that have joined us today. Thank you so much for giving us an hour and a half of your time to learn more. I look forward to further webinars and discussions with all of you in terms of moving forward and what we can all do together. Second off, I'd like to send so much gratitude to Morna, Christopher, and Dawn for sharing your expertise and knowledge. I know that every time I listen to each of you speak, my mind grows bigger and bigger. For me personally, I know that it takes a little while to process the information. So if anybody has any additional questions or burning questions they want to address, please send them to me and I will be happy to get the answers for you. So with that, I will say goodbye to everybody. Stay warm, which is easy with these temperatures these days. Stay safe and healthy. And thanks again, everyone, for your time today.